Hello and welcome to the Tennessee Informer. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Our guest tonight is Dr. Joe Wolverton, JD. Joe is the John Birch Society's constitutional law scholar and head of a dedicated think tank focused on promoting and preserving the U.S. Constitution, using his profound passion for constitutional law as well as his wealth of knowledge and experience. As a distinguished attorney and scholar, he consistently defends and upholds the principles enshrined in our Constitution, as well as restoring the knowledge of the authors whose works influenced the thinking and writing of our founding fathers. He's written 4 books, including The Real James Madison, What Degree of Madness, Madison's Method to Make America States Again. He also hosts the popular YouTube channel Teacher of Liberty and the TikTok channel Joe Wolverton JD. Joe, glad to have you back with us. Really appreciate you taking the time. I know you were swamped, especially with your new job.
Oh, I always got time for Tennessee, man. I'm swamped with a lot of stuff, but never too swamped to come on your show, Dave.
All right, well, I appreciate that.
I just apologize to everybody for my voice. I've been at it since 7 o'clock this morning and gone kind of raspy.
Okay, well, we'll be fine. Before we get to make states great again, we were talking before we started, and this whole thing between Trump and the judiciary and all these rogue judges and this whole idea of judicial supremacy, where the president that's elected by the whole country is apparently, he's at the whim of a district federal judge or several district federal judges. What are your thoughts about this?
Well, lots of things. I mean, first of all, the founders didn't fight a war against a monarch just to give final authority to one unelected lawyer in a robe. That makes no sense to anyone. There's no way you would say, yeah, it's worth going to war for the next 8 years to allow one unelected person to overthrow the will of ever how many million Americans who voted for Donald Trump. And, there's supposed to be 3 co-equal branches, right? The judicial branch, even Hamilton said, it's the least dangerous, but because he said, I'm just quoting him, has no influence over either the sword or the purse. Well, you can't be the least dangerous and be all powerful at the same time. And one thing that occurred to me that you and I talked about earlier was all these, capital C conservatives who came out and have consistently over the years preached the doctrine of supremacy clause means anything the federal government does is supreme over anything, over the states, over anything else. They're the ones that led us down this road, yep. Right? The anti-states' rights crowd led us to the road that we're on now. But you look and these people are now saying, no, because they're also MAGA, they're saying we can't have a judge override the president. Well, you're the very ones who led us to this situation. Yep. You by saying that the Supreme, and these people still, Dave, they're still saying, well, no one judge can override the president, however, unless it's the Supreme Court, unless it's 5 judges. Yeah. So we're looking at, the whole thing that being America, being, in no exaggeration of terms, an oligarchy ruled by, in this case, some of these cases, one solo lawyer turned, put a black robe on him, and suddenly he's king. Yep. Literally, we're giving this man power of king. And in the case of the Supreme Court, 5 judges, and I don't know that these 5 judges would side with Trump today. There's a few of them that have gone a little loose in the turn, if you know what I mean, when it comes to supporting conservative causes. And so, their job is to decide cases, period. They do not have the authority to issue nationwide injunctions that paralyze an elected president from carrying out his constitutional duties. That's just the facts. There's no way anyone who reveres or thinks the Constitution should be followed thinks that what's happening with these rogue judges is good or correct or constitutional. But again, think what you've done by redefining and misapplying the supremacy clause. you've led us down this road to where people are like, well, he's a federal judge. What does that have to, that has nothing to do with the issue. The issue is the president has a constitutional duty to, to faithfully execute the laws. And as he sees that, particularly in most of the cases of Donald Trump, he is the head of the executive, and these orders affect executive branch agencies. He is very much entitled constitutionally to do what he's doing. And the federal judge is not at all entitled to do what they are doing. Not one, not five, not 100. Should be able to offset, should be able to overrule a president carrying out his constitutionally mandated authority. And I don't know where we became so slavish to the notion. And like I said, it's probably 100 years of being taught the supremacy clause incorrectly, and it led us to this place to where you hear people saying, I don't think a judge, but not expressing why, right? The Constitution, right. The Constitution, within the four corners of that document, is found the universe of power of the president and the federal courts. And the federal courts no way and nowhere in Article 3 are given authority to override a presidential decision, particularly one that covers the executive branch over which he is the head. It seems very simple. I really don't understand. I mean, you got the whole take care clause, right? The president, Article 3, Section 3, the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed. That's not optional. That's one of his mandates, one of his obligations.
And that's regardless of what, the court may not agree with him, but
yeah,
they don't have to agree with him. That's, he wasn't, they didn't set it up to where, okay, you've got to go to the judges and see if they agree with you. If they agree with you, then you can act. No, that's not the way it was designed.
That's not Republican government. That's oligarchy. And if Congress, all lawmaking power herein granted is vested in Congress.
Yep.
So only Congress can make laws. So the president, if he were to be challenged in any of this, it would be by Congress making a law saying that they want to change the law to make it where a president doesn't have such and such authority. And then if Congress and the president came into a constitutional clash, then the Supreme Court can give its opinion.
Right.
But that doesn't empower, even that doesn't empower some individual in San Francisco to stand up and say on his own and say, we're not enforcing. And the problem, Dave, this is what gets me crazy. The problem isn't that judge. Tyrant's going to tyrant. Yeah. Deep state's going to deep state. Yeah. The problem is that so many of us just accept it.
Right.
We think that somewhere, somehow, that judge got the authority. And the president is not a clerk who submits proposals to a judge and then, bound by some diktat from a lower bench.
Right.
That's ridiculous to think that the president is subservient to some lone rogue federal judge in some far-flung district court. That boggles the mind that there are people who really think that.
Yeah,
that somehow this judge is over the president. Now, like I say, if the president is taking care that the law be faithfully executed, and he's doing it wrong or interpreting wrong, that's Congress's job.
Right.
To address that with a law. Yeah. It isn't a judicial, a black-robed oligarch's job to stand up, and in this case, autocrat.
Right.
One judge stands up and says, no, we're not enforcing that, and the whole world's like, all right. Yeah. I think, that famous, it's often attributed to Andrew Jackson. He didn't really say it, but that quotation, John Marshall made his decision, now let him enforce it.
Yep.
I think Trump should really say that. I mean, Andrew Jackson didn't say that, but Trump should really say that. Fine, judge, whatever made his decision, enforce it.
Yeah, they have no power. The only power they have is the power given to them by Congress. And as much as I'm all for impeaching some of these judges,
Oh yeah,
that's hard to do. But here's what's not hard to do. The Congress can rein them in. They can strip their power. They can dissolve that whole district. And that's
There's
what we
only
need them to do. We need Congress to do their job.
we need a lot more backbone in D.C. A president with a backbone that says, no, y'all don't control me like that. That he made a constitutional oath to take care that the laws are carried out. And then we need a Congress who recognizes, guess what? There's only one court constitutionally mandated,
Yep.
and that's the Supreme Court.
Right.
The rest of y'all, you serve at our will,
Right.
and we are the representatives of the people. I mean, if you would take this to its logical conclusion, Dave, this would make the Constitution, when it was written, a suicide pact,
Yeah.
right? Because it turns into a permission slip from one unelected lawyer to handcuff the president of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's beyond reasonable. None of those men in Philadelphia in 1787 would have voted to send that Constitution out to the states if it had contained a provision saying anytime a federal judge decides he doesn't like what the president does, he may override the president's will.
Yeah. Yeah. They were worried about a judiciary that was going to be too. Matter of fact, they kind of predicted this. I don't think they predicted how stupid our country would become, though. I don't know if they quite predicted how gullible our people are, because, like you said, we've heard this preached for our whole life, and then before that, the federal government is supreme in all things, and oh, by the way, the judiciary is the final arbiter of any constitutional question, which just turns the whole thing on its head.
Yeah, you can't point to a provision in the Constitution that sets out the process of a judicial veto.
Nope.
You cannot point me to that provision because it doesn't exist. It's not justice, it's sabotage,
Right.
and it's completely outside the framework of the Constitution. I think it's a weapon of. I think it's another example of lawfare. I think it's another example of the deep state attempting to use Obama-appointed judges to thwart the will of the people, just like it tried to do with the many cases against Trump. I like the statement from Jefferson that to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions is a very dangerous doctrine, and one which would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy.
Absolutely.
I mean, that's a mic drop moment. Jefferson pushes the podium over and walks out. It's simple as that. There's no mechanism for judicial veto. This is an act of the deep state to use lawfare as they've continually done. There's nothing, it's a complete sabotage of constitutional order. The president needs to just
Yep.
say, fine, he issued an order, I'm issuing a contrary order, and let that be, and realize that the Constitution is not to be used as some sort of justification for one lawyer
Right.
to override the will of the president, and certainly not to handcuff him, particularly when it pertains to the executive branch.
Right.
That no sense at all.
This, I think we have too many people in our mind have substituted the word of a judge as being the same as the rule of law. So if a judge speaks, it's the rule of law, and if you don't go along with what that judge says, well, you don't have respect for the rule of law. No, the rule of the law is the Constitution, and I'm just disappointed that there's nobody in Trump's inner circle that's saying, hey, look, just tell that guy to pound sand. and just go tell the public what you're going to do and why you're going to do it and why that judge does not have the authority. And stop playing the game. Stop playing, well, okay, we're not going to disobey a federal judge, and we're going to, no. Pam Bondi should only show up to tell them, hey, you don't have the authority, and here's what tell them what's going to happen, not that we're going to, we're going to plead, we're going to beg, and we're going to grovel. That just disgusts me. So anyway, that's.
But again, it's reducing the president to a clerk of that judge who begs permission. No, that's not the way this was intended. That's not a Republican form of government, because we're now not being ruled by our elected representatives. We're being ruled by an unelected, unaccountable judge that no one in this country ever vetted in any appreciable way with regard to his understanding of the Constitution or the political issues that face the Union. There's no way that we can consider that to be Republican form of government, and there's no way that anybody with any good sense would support this, which makes it clear why all the pro-supremacy clause people do support it.
One last thing I want to say on this. I know you're familiar with Article 3, Section 2, and it talks about limiting the appellate jurisdiction of not just any federal court, but of the Supreme Court as well. So how would the founders would not have put that in there, that you can limit the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, and whether or not you make any other courts is up to you, Congress, but you make the regulations and the exceptions. So how can you read that and come away with the idea that the Supreme Court or any court is the final arbiter of all constitutional questions? You wouldn't limit them that way if you intended them to be the final arbiter, would you?
There you go. If you intended the Supreme Court to be the boss, there's two things that would need to change. Number one, Supreme Court decisions would have to be listed as the supreme law of the land. They aren't. That's telling. In Article 6, where it lists the supreme law of the land, it does not list Supreme Court opinions, and that's on purpose. Secondly, the Constitution, laws made pursuant to the Constitution, and treaties. Nowhere does it say Supreme Court opinions, because, again, none of those men sitting there in 1787 would have stood for that. They'd have got up and walked out. Yep. And the second thing is, it wouldn't place Congress in control of the jurisdiction of the federal courts if the federal courts were meant to be more powerful than Congress and the executive. That is senseless. That is a non sequitur. It does not follow that I'm going to appoint this body to be in charge of determining the limits of your authority, yet somehow you're able to determine the limits of your own authority. Those two things cannot coexist. Absolutely. So Congress is obviously meant to be, in this case, superior to the federal courts, because Congress determines the boundaries of its jurisdiction.
Absolutely.
That, to me, is case open and closed.
Yep. Well, that's what we need to insist. I'm all for if they impeach any of these people, but
for sure.
That's gravy. What they really need to do is get off their butt and put limits on these people. And that would just solve so many of our problems. So much of our division in this country is because of the court and the power that we've allowed them to take.
Well, that's true. Now, that is a true statement. But so much of the division is because, you've got people who still believe that capital R Republican equals constitutionalist. And it just doesn't. They don't have the backbone to stand up. They continually, unconstitutionally, delegate their authority to either the courts, as we see here, or the president when it comes to waging war. And so that's where we're at. We're at a situation in our history. Why? Because congressmen don't want to be held individually liable, and they would have to be if they supported this or that. So you see Republicans just going along to get along, and just hopeful for that, because they know that 4% of them will be reelected.
Yep, absolutely. And rhino is really not a strong enough word for a good chunk of them anymore. I think reptile and obviously reprobate, will cover a lot of them as well.
That's true.
Anyway, let's go ahead and let's talk some more about the way things were supposed to be, and let's talk about your project with the John Birch Society, Make States Great Again.
Make America States Again. Yeah.
Yes, I'm
Make
sorry.
America. No, you're
Make
right.
America States Again.
Right. Make America States Again. It's not just a slogan. It's our strategy. We want to return to first principles. We want to a revival of our republic as it was originally intended to function, where the states are sovereign, the federal government is the servant, and the Constitution chained down the Leviathan. That's what Make America States Again is. It was created to do. It was based on my book, you see on my shelf over there, What Degree of Madness, based on which itself is based on James Madison's counsel in Federalist number 46. It's a blueprint for the sovereign states and how they go about limiting the federal government. One thing, Dave, if we could get into people's heads, this country did not begin as one nation indivisible. It was a union of, as James Madison says in Federalist 39, independent sovereign states. 13 sovereign republics ratified a constitution delegating a short list of powers to a federal agent, a federal servant, a federal employee, right? That's how it was formed. That's how it was intended to function. And Make America States Again is our effort from the John Birch Society, and has been my effort since I wrote that book several years ago, to show people that there is a way to force the federal beast back inside its constitutional cage without a bloody, so-called civil war. We don't need to do that, right? And that there are ways to do this that are set forth, particularly by James Madison in Federalist 46, and in 45, to be honest, where, he mentions there are supposed to be so few things that the federal government is involved in, we should hardly notice its existence as citizens. The states are the ones that are, and go read Federalist 45 for yourselves, and then read 46, right? The states, Madison said, the powers of the states are numerous and indefinite, and they're the ones who are supposed to have something to say, something that, as we say in the law, touches and concerns your life, your day-to-day life, right? Your property, your life, your liberty, all of this, the crimes and everything. The federal government is supposed to basically handle international trade and war, right? That's pretty much all they were supposed to do. And commerce among the states and international commerce. That's all they were supposed to do, right? That's how it was designed. And so too many people have been convinced that there just is no way. But if the Constitution were followed today, as it was written, as it was intended, in its intended form, the Union, and its intended function, the Constitution, 90% of the federal government would be gone because it's unconstitutional.
This is kind of like a doge for the federal government.
Yeah, it's not hyperbole. That's just history.
Yep.
Right. That's just the facts. And that's the thing with basing this all on Federalist 46. I'm not asking you to believe me. Madison, who we gave the sobriquet of, father of the Constitution, he's the one who laid out in 45 and 46 the sovereignty, and like I say in 39, the sovereign independent republics. How often are we taught that in school? Never. Ever. That's why people who are conservatives and constitutions and still send their kids to school, that also blows my mind. Because I'm like, they're going to be taught untruths. They're going to be taught to disbelieve in your faith. They're going to be taught principles that run contrary to the principles held dear by your family. Yet you continue to send them to that indoctrination camp. Yep. But imagine, we want to have a generation that will rise up having been taught from the cradle that the Constitution was ratified by states creating a federal servant, that the states are sovereign, that there are ways to keep the federal government inside its constitutional boundaries, that we can do that. Teach them the true history of how the Union came to be, how the Constitution was intended to function. And, so that's basically it. And we talk about, we used to call it nullification. I mean, we still do call it that. The strategy, we used to call it nullification. Now we call it Make America States Again, but it's still the same thing.
Right.
You
have to have that. There's no way getting around it. You have to have it.
Right. Yeah. No, the states created the federal government, not the other way around. And so what you create, you control.
Right.
Right. And so Jefferson, I'm just going to read this from the Kentucky resolutions. Whensoever the general, what we call the federal government, assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. That's nullification, as Jefferson later calls it, the rightful remedy to federal tyranny. The rightful remedy is for states to recognize their role as sovereigns, to recognize their role as the people who established the boundaries of federal power and are meant to enforce those boundaries. As Madison says in 46, those states are meant to be a barricade between the people and unconstitutional acts of the federal government. That's what's supposed to happen. And it's not and this thing that blows my mind, well, we're just going to have rebellion. These are just states trying to refight the Civil War. No, it's a simple expression of basic law of contracts. The Founding Fathers repeatedly in the Federalist Papers and elsewhere, even in the Convention of 1787, all the ratifying conventions, called the Constitution a contract or a compact, which is the same thing. Right. And it's basically this, that when I, as an employer, set the boundaries of your authority, if you as an employee act outside the boundaries of that authority, those acts are not binding on me. It's as simple as that. It's carried out in courtrooms all over the country all the time, Dave. I've seen it as a lawyer, where you go in and you sit there and you see case after case where judges uphold the principle of nullification when it comes to regular everyday contracts. But because of the 100 years and more of indoctrination,
right,
under the management of the federal Leviathan, we've come to believe as a people that states are somehow subordinate, even though they pre-existed the Union,
yep,
right? Because you weren't in the Union. Look at the Constitution. Article 7, you're not in the Union until you ratify. Yep. This is an entirely new Union, an entirely new form of government, yep, an entirely new Constitution. And he clearly says that it only takes 9, right? The
yep,
Constitution. So Madison answered, what would happen with the other 4? They'd remain independent sovereign republics. So this is a new union created by those states. And it's such an easily discovered point of historical fact that it really does make me understand that people who argue against it have some sort of agenda, right? They have an agenda that leads them to oppose this. And I don't know what that agenda might be. Self-aggrandizement in the case of many of them, ignorance in the case of others. I don't know. Maybe they're being, paid to oppose it by moneyed interests. I don't know. And it doesn't really matter so long as we get the people to understand that it's not resistance, it's the rule of law.
right,
It's simply a state saying, that's unconstitutional, we won't comply. And it's no different than when I would see in a courtroom a case where a guy was hired to do one job, decides on his own will that he's going to do the job a different way than is contained in the contract, and the judge nullifying that contract because the agent, the employee, the person hired to do a job, acted outside the contractually agreed upon authority.
Yep.
And when he does, Dave, you can go to court tomorrow and you'll see this over and over and over. But again, because we've been indoctrinated for so long with the misreading, and I think purposeful misreading, of the Supremacy Clause, we don't understand that the states created the federal government for a very few and defined, as Madison says, purposes. Yeah. Nullification is baked into our American DNA.
Absolutely.
The Stamp Act,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The Coercive Acts, from the jump, the White Pine Acts. I mean, we're from the beginning, the Navigation Acts, all of them. Before we were even a union, when we were independent colonies, and we would say, I've got a book I'm putting together of nullification of the acts of the British government in the 1600s,
yeah.
where up in Massachusetts, they'd be like, no, we're not doing that. That doesn't jibe with Magna Carta. We're not doing that. That doesn't jibe with the Bill of Rights. We're not doing that. Yeah. Right? Simple as that. This is baked into who we are. Yeah. You can't revere Sam Adams on one hand, yeah. and then badmouth nullification on the other, yeah. because those are two opinions that are contradictory. You can't hold them both. You can badmouth Sam Adams and badmouth nullification, but you can't have it the other way around.
Absolutely.
You can't praise him and pillory the other.
Yeah.
You've got to realize that nullification, and I wish that hadn't been called that before the so-called Civil War, because that's what puts a bad taste in people's mouth. But when you explain it like I'm doing and like you do, it becomes so clear that when you study just a little bit of the history of how the Constitution came to be, how it was intended to function, if you read just the Federalist Papers, you don't even have to read the Anti-Federalists. You read the Federalists, you come to find out how it was intended to function, the role the states played. Right. I get kickback from people, conservatives, when I read, and I put it up on the big screen when I give presentations, where in Federalist 39, Madison said, these states are independent, sovereign republics, subject to none other than their own voluntary will.
Yeah, well, that's what it says. That was the intention.
I can't help it. That's what they did.
Yeah.
This is not a nation that got divided up into districts. That's not what happened. Right. 13 independent republics said, look, we've got some things in common. Let's hire an agent to do those things for us that we have in common, and everything else we keep to ourselves. It's pretty simple. If you can understand English, you can read the 10th Amendment, and it's pretty clear.
And you mentioned the Civil War, and I think that's, of course, a lot of people say, well, the Civil War changed all that. Well, the Civil War kept the states in the Union through the force of arms, okay? As far as constitutional changes of the structure, the 14th Amendment as passed, not as currently perverted, but as passed, did not make us one consolidated nation, not by the words of it, and it did not undo the 10th Amendment.
The 10th Amendment hasn't been repealed.
Right.
I've got my little pocket constitution. It's still in there.
Right, and occasionally the court will actually fine for it. So so there's a lot of misunderstanding because of that, and then over the years, and really, I mentioned the 14th Amendment. I think that's by far the most perverted amendment in our Constitution, from the way it was perpetrated on the people, from the way it was changed over the years to mean something that it never was intended to mean. And of course, the court did that, and they really started that roughly 60 years after the fact. But
you look at every Supreme Court decision on gay marriage, on what's the other one?
Abortion, you name it.
Abortion, you name it.
Yep.
Any political question like that, and those decisions are always based on the 14th Amendment.
Yeah, a perversion of the 14th Amendment, I would argue.
Well, right. Yeah. Exactly. I mean, you think about it, Dave. It means nullification. First of all, this is maybe a shock to people, but it's working right now effectively. Nullification works, and we know that because all these states that you can buy recreational weed. I lived in Arizona. You could go down and it just, I mean, it looks like a Circle K. And you can buy weed and you can go home and smoke it.
Yeah.
I lived in Idaho. In Idaho, you can go to the grocery store and buy raw milk. Both those things, weed being sold like that, raw milk being sold in the grocery store, both those things are done in contravention of federal law. Well, guess what? Idaho and Arizona are still in the Union. There's not a federal force marching toward Boise or toward Phoenix, right? Those two states, Colorado, right? All of these things, all of these states that ignore certain gun regulations.
Yep.
This is the thing also that people need to understand. Nullification is not going to tear the Union apart. And you know how I know? Because it hasn't. And federal laws have been nullified, and they're being nullified today.
Yeah.
Right? Nothing happens bad. That's the thing. People want a convention, a constitutional convention. Guess what? There's just a bunch of question marks and not a bunch of periods in that. Right? When it comes to nullification, there are no question marks because it's working right now safely, constitutionally sound,
Yep.
and you don't have to find any external justification. It's right there in the Constitution, particularly in the black letter of the 10th Amendment.
Yep.
It's right there. You don't have to make up like these groups that support a convention. They make promises that they know they can't keep. They know they won't be held to keep because by the time, heaven forbid, something like that happened, they would wash their hands of it. They would straight up Pontius Pilate that business and claim, well, there's nothing I can do against George Soros and Bill Gates and all of them, the WEF. There's nothing I can do.
Well, who do they think's going to enforce it? If they come up with another constitution or several constitutions, who do they think's going to enforce it? If the states don't enforce it, it's not going to be. It's moot.
Right, it's moot, and not only that, but there'd be another, because there'd be somebody unhappy with what that convention. So there'd be another one making promises, just like there are politicians who, no sooner have they lifted their hand off the Bible from taking their oath of office, swearing to God to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution, then they take that hand off the Bible and they use it to vote for something unconstitutional.
Well, 95% of our government is unconstitutional. 95% of which you know that. I mean, it's pathetic how much it's unconstitutional.
And we could apply this to anything: schools, speech, vaccinations.
Yep.
You simply say, "Not here." I don't care if you want to do it in other states. Knock yourself out. I live here in Tennessee like you do. I can't walk down the street and buy weed and bring it home and smoke it legally. But I could do that in Arizona. I mean, I didn't, but I could have done that in Arizona, right? And that's why we can do that about anything. We can do that about mandated shots, about things taught in school, about free speech, the lack of free speech. We can do all these things, and it's constitutionally sound.
Right.
It's spelled out clearly in the 10th Amendment, and it's being used right this very minute, and safely so. Right, in so many ways, and we can continue to do that. We simply have to, have concerned citizens pressuring their elected state legislators to uphold their Article 6 oath to the Constitution, and instead of acting as vassals of the Empire on the Potomac.
Yeah.
You've got your choice. You either true to your oath that you probably swore to God, how most people do it, even though that's not constitutionally required. You're either true to your oath and you keep the federal government inside its constitutional boundaries, or you decide to violate your oath, which you probably swore to God, violate your oath, and you allow these states to become nothing more than servants when they were meant to be the master.
Absolutely. And like you said, it's a variety of issues. You mentioned the schools. We passed some laws in Tennessee a few years ago in reference to obscenity in the classroom. And my state senator, he's a lawyer, John Stevens, and of course he's not the only one that thinks this way. Right. Well, we can't enforce that. It's not constitutional because Well, why is it not? Well, the Miller test. Well, the Miller test is a reference to a Supreme Court obscenity test, a test created by the Supreme Court. And this is forced down on the states because the states are cowardly and stupid enough to accept it. And so they decide.
What does our Tennessee Constitution call it, Dave? Slavish and absurd.
Well, and we got plenty of slavish and absurd politicians.
We got a capital full of them.
Yeah, starting with the governor.
Amen. That's the most ridiculous thing. People look at me. Today, I had someone say, "Man, you must have it real good. Y'all got a super majority of Republicans, a Republican governor." I'm like, "Are you kidding me?" They're Republican because that's how they can get elected.
Yeah.
They don't act like they don't care about the Constitution. Yeah. They don't care about anything but being elected. They don't care about anything but this is a springboard to Washington for them. With the way not all of them. There's a few exceptions.
Yeah, with the exception of a few in the House and even fewer in the Senate, they're basically reptiles and reprobates. That's what runs Tennessee, and it seems to be getting worse every day.
Now, let me read this to you, man, because this is something that I think puts like that perfect little cap on the pen. This is Federalist number 26, written by Alexander Hamilton, if you can believe this, who I wouldn't give you a plug nickel for, but he did write this in Federalist 26. He says, the state legislatures, who will always be not only vigilant, now remember what he said, state legislatures, will be vigilant and suspicious and jealous guardians of the rights of the citizens against encroachments from the federal government. They, the state legislatures, will constantly have their attention awake to the conduct of the national rulers. And now here's the phrase, he's coming up the punch here. And they, the state legislatures, will be ready enough if anything improper appears. So if the federal government does anything unconstitutional, to sound the alarm to the people, and not only to be the voice of the people, but if necessary, the arm of their discontent.
Absolutely. Now, I want to say something on that because most people will say, well, that was before the 17th Amendment. And since we no longer have our legislatures elect our senators, we can't really do anything. Now, I didn't realize until within the last week that before we elected them, I always thought that we had recall on the senators. That's what I've always been led to believe, that before the legislators, when they were electing them, and before we elected them as a whole, that state legislatures could, hire and fire at will.
No,
that's not the case.
Right, that's not the case, but they often did refuse to seat them. Right, they didn't recall them, but there were many cases where the senators simply wouldn't take their seat, or where the Senate would refuse to allow new senators to take their seats because they didn't like that the senators, represented a certain political bent, right, from the states, and so the Senate would try to pass rules that would refuse to seat the senators. So there wasn't a provision, a process for recall, but there was there wasn't de jure recall, but there was de facto recall in the fact that often they just wouldn't send them, or the Senate itself would refuse to seat them. And so there were mechanisms that the states could more directly affect federal legislation. But that's neither here nor there when it comes to the division of power as drawn up in the Constitution. We know that the states are sovereign. We know they created the federal government. That's indisputable. We know that they granted in writing to the federal government certain few and defined powers. We know that the 10th Amendment makes provision that if a power is not granted to the federal government in the Constitution, that power is retained. You can't retain what you've never had.
Right.
So we know the direction of power went from state to fed. We know that the Federalist Papers over and over declare the founding fathers in their papers and in their essays declared, and I would say most clearly in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, as well as in Madison's report of 1800. If you haven't read anything, read those. Get your mind right when it comes to the relationship, the intended relationship between the states and the federal government, the states as creator, the federal government as creature, the states as employer, the federal government as employee. It's very clearly stated in the Virginia Resolution, Kentucky Resolution, Madison's report of 1800, Federalist 39, Federalist 45, Federalist 46. Here we see Federalist 26 by Hamilton, that the states would not only be the voice, but the arm of the people's discontent with federal overreach.
Right. So not having those senators appointed, there's still no excuse, because the state legislature and the governor, assuming he had a spine, they could still, I would think if you had your state legislature and your governor speaking out about votes made by your state, by your federal, your U.S. senators or your U.S. reps, if your state elected officials started giving those people down the road for what they were doing, instead of sucking up to them like they mostly do, I think you'd have even though they can't directly elect them anymore, I guarantee you that would have an impact.
Oh, there's no question. It really would be. It takes that, Madison talks about it in Federalist 46. It takes that one state to sound that general alarm that will draw other states to it. And it's like I said in other places, when I was a teacher and I would give tests, you'd have, they'd all sit there and I could tell who was finished, who wasn't, but they would all wait. One guy would come up, turn in his test, suddenly 20 kids are finished at the same time. Well, why? Because they wanted someone to break the seal, right? And so I think, and it won't be Tennessee because of the fact that our, most of our representatives, with the exception of a very few who are beyond, Bud Halsey, Senator,
Bowling.
trying to think of her name, Senator Bowling, those people are worth their weight in platinum. But most of them, including the governor down, are traitors to not only Tennessee, the Republic of Tennessee, but to the United States Constitution as well. But if we had some state that would stand up and say, okay, here's the deal. We understand the 10th Amendment. We understand the history of the formation of the Constitution, how it was intended to function, and we're going to enforce that function by refusing, as Madison says, refusing to cooperate with the Union whenever the federal government exceeds its constitutional authority. We will not carry that out. We will not participate. That state would break the seal, in my analogy, and I think others would join it when they saw that, no, there weren't armies marching on Nashville. There weren't armies marching on Jefferson City, right? That there aren't armies marching on Boise or Phoenix. When we see this happen, but in a broader way than just raw milk or marijuana, when we see it expanded to there's a blanket law in this state that we will stand on our rights as sovereign, independent republics and stand on the authority of the 10th Amendment to refuse to enforce any unconstitutional act of the federal government. I'm telling you, I think once one state has the testicular fortitude to do that, you will see others fall in line. But right now, we're just waiting for that one state to break the seal.
Yeah. Well, and
I wish it could be. I wish it could be ours. It's not going to be.
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be either. I don't know what happened to the volunteer state. We went from having people like John Sevier and Davy Crockett to people like Bill Haslam and Bill Lee and Sexton and McNally and all these other disgraceful
That's
people.
barely been 200 years.
Yeah.
My fourth great grandpa lived just down the street from me and voted for David Crockett. That was his congressman.
Wow.
William Wolverton voted for David Crockett as his congressman. And now...
Who's your congressman now?
My state... I don't have, my state. I go by those the Freedom Index.
Right.
So that's the thing that JBS does. That's also so invaluable of a tool.
Right.
You can go. I think it's maybe thefreedomindex.org.
Yeah, I looked at that the other day. Right.
Yeah, you can put your state rep in there and your state senator, and it'll show you how often he votes constitutionally, how often he votes unconstitutionally. But the point is, that's only been 200 years.
Yeah, that's a steep decline. Very steep.
That's a steep decline for 200 years. That's incredible, and I'm hopeful that we can educate enough people. I don't want to leave Tennessee, man. My family's been here for over 200 years. I don't want to leave, but I will not stay and be ruled over by traitors, right? So we got to find that place, and that one state that does it, boy, I can tell you, Joey's address changes within a month.
Well, you probably won't be the only one. I'm sure there'll be others.
Oh, there'll be that. Then that's the point. I mean, you imagine having a state who, because of their action, because of their strength and courage, because of their constitutional savvy,
right,
because of their constitutional wisdom, they stand up to the federal overreach. They will draw to them freedom lovers from all over.
Yep.
And you talk about having a disproportionate amount of power. You get those people drawn to a state like Missouri, state like Mississippi, Alabama, anywhere. I don't care. It could be I don't know about North Dakota. I don't know if I could stomach. I have to hold my nose to go. Yeah, that's right. The people do want the government to take care of them, but we've been taught that the government would. Yeah. We've been taught that it would. So as soon as we can get a state to do that, and it starts, Dave, I'm going to tell you, it starts with teaching these principles to our children so that they don't grow up having to be deprogrammed.
Yeah. Well, Booster just mentioned that everybody wants to be taken care of by the government. Well, that's the reason we're in the mess we're in financially. The federal government can't afford it, but they have the ability to print money. Okay? And
they have the ability to lease, to sign leases of land to the tune of 78% of the land in the West.
Yeah.
You've got some of these states like Nevada, Idaho, Utah practically belong to the Chinese because we're using that federal land, which also is prescribed in the Constitution, how the federal government can come to control land, and it ain't by declaring it a park or a BLM reserve or something. But, you use those as surety for your loans.
Yeah.
And now you've got, essentially a situation where it's now or never. It really is. It really is getting to that point where this generation that's coming up, I'm hopeful that the homeschool movement continues to crescendo so we can have that generation that grows up knowing these truths from the cradle and will say, we're going to enforce the Constitution because we were taught correctly about it. They will never have heard the Supremacy Clause nonsense. They will never have been taught that nullification is rebellion. They never would have been taught that the 14th Amendment makes it okay to murder babies. They never would have been taught all of these things, that the Supreme Court is the ultimate arbiter of what is and is not the law. These kids, you got to understand, they will never have been taught that, and that will be a glorious day when they get to the age that they can use that wisdom, use that knowledge to force that federal beast back down with the chains of the Constitution.
Yeah. Well, a lot of people say, well, nullification is chaos, but I think we're currently in chaos. And the only way we stay together as a country long term, in my opinion, is if we start following the 10th, if the states start nullifying garbage from the federal government. I don't see how we stay together long term if we don't do that. This top-down garbage is not going to continue to work.
Yeah, you can either have peaceful, nullification. You can either use a scalpel where you can use a chainsaw
Right.
to cut out these tumors of tyranny. And I'm telling you, nullification, we know it's not chaos because you could go right now to Idaho and buy raw milk at the grocery store and no one's going to look at you. You can go down to every block just about in Colorado and Arizona has somewhere to buy recreational marijuana. There's no chaos there because the people there voted for that stuff. It doesn't affect me in Tennessee. I don't have to deal with
all the potheads and all the
potheads.
Yeah.
I don't have to deal with that
Yeah.
because it isn't chaos. It's safe, and we're not saying that each individual gets to pick and choose the laws he wants to abide by. But we are saying each individual should be able to live under laws that he consents to. And the quickest way, the most American way to do that is through the states.
Right.
They pre-existed the Union. You can vote with your feet,
Yep.
right? And but you can't do that if we're adopting this, like you called it, top-down authoritarian empire. We can't do that. We can't vote with our feet because, that Abe de Mobley, he famously said to John Adams, the great advantage of the United States is that y'all didn't combine yourself into one nation with one set of laws for everybody. He's like, that's your great advantage. Well, now today, that must be our great disadvantage that we seemingly have, because you can't tell me that that's not chaos when you have the same laws, for example, governing, rainwater in Arizona and Maine, or Arizona and Washington State. That's ridiculous. One place it never rains, other place it rains all the time. You can't tell me that that's not ridiculous to try. And none of the founding fathers would agree on a union of 330 million people being ruled over by 5 black-robed judges.
Yep.
None of them would agree to that. And that is why nullification is so important, because you not only get to say no to Congress, you get to say no to the president, you get to say no to the courts, because you get to enforce the boundaries on all 3 branches.
Yep.
Nullification allows you to do that. You can say, no, I'm not having a same-sex couple married. No, we're not doing that here.
Yep.
We're not doing that, right? You get to nullify all unconstitutional acts, not just ones committed by the president or Congress. You get to also nullify unconstitutional acts of the Supreme Court. You literally get to create a place where the people are happy to be there. They feel they get to pursue happiness because they're living under laws that they consented to.
Yeah. And all the wackos can go to New York and California, and the sane people can move to sane states.
Exactly. Yeah, if you want to have 5 people married, if you want to marry your dog, if you want to have it legal to smoke weed in Walmart, knock yourselves out. If that's what you want to do in your state. That doesn't mean I have to do it in mine, and it's not chaos. Because I'm not going to move to your state. You're not going to move to mine, where marriage is defined as one man and one woman, where we don't legalize drugs for recreational use, where we allow you to drink milk right out of the udder if you want to, right? I mean, that's the glory of it. In the United States, in the Union of Sovereign Republics, as created here, you get to vote with your feet, and you get to live around people who share your principles. Now, how it is now, we don't get to do that at all. We do not get to live in a state where we feel we've consented to the laws, because this top-down imperial authoritarian rule prevents us from doing that. But there is a rightful remedy, and it is nullification, and it is safely being carried out right now all over from sea to shining sea. But it starts with, you got to quit focusing on the swamp. Well, the swamp in D.C., and focus on the swamp in Nashville or
Yep.
Jefferson
Because
City.
we got
or
a
whatever.
swamp, I'll tell you that. We definitely have a swamp.
You ain't just whistling Dixie there.
Yeah.
We definitely did.
Well, Joe, any closing thoughts?
No, I just wish that people would awake and throw off these chains that have been silently and gradually, as Madison said, put upon us. In the next couple of weeks, I've got a new and expanded biography of James Madison coming out, including Mr. Madison's Republican essays that people rarely have read. They have been published in over 100 years, and including his religious points of view that never get talked about. And got some really good books coming out from Western Islands Publishing with JBS. And I'm telling you, if anybody feels, because this is the conversation I had with a lot of people on X recently, if you feel like you really want to do this, you really want to learn these things, you want to have some sort of influence, but you feel ignorant or you feel unaware of how to do it, you join the John Birch Society and you instantly have guidance, you instantly have access to resources, and you won't feel so impotent anymore. You'll feel empowered. And it's so good, if for no other reason than joining with like-minded folks in doing what you know to be right, which is upholding this document that I believe was inspired of God. And I think that the only way we're ever going to win this is when we do join in like a Sons of Liberty 2.0. That's what I call the John Birch Society, the Sons of Liberty 2.0. Get your resources, get together with people, and we really can make America great again by making America states again. And we really can do it.
Absolutely. And I think we have to do that in order to make it great again. Well, hey, thanks for coming on, and thanks for all you do.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Same to you.
I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch our program tonight. Please be sure to hit the like and subscribe buttons as well as the notification bell so you never miss an episode. We truly appreciate your support. Check out our radio podcast on iHeartRadio, Spotify, and other platforms as well. Sign up for our weekly newsletter at our website, tninformer.com. Please find and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at TNInformer. An announcement for tonight: if you want to learn the Tennessee Constitution so that you know what is lawful, then here's your chance. Attorney Jeff Cobble will be teaching a class on the Tennessee State Constitution Saturday, April 12th from 1 to 6 p.m. Central at Peachtree Learning Center, which is an old church. It's located at 100 North Main Street, Sparta, Tennessee. Call 931-316-9639 to reserve a seat. It's free, but donations are accepted. Tonight we will have a second show with Amy Miller at 8:30. That's concerning legislation working its way through the General Assembly. Please join us again at 8:30 p.m. Central for Lawyers, Lies, and Pesticides. Who can we trust? Our guest next week will be Kathy Henners, author, retired police officer, and expert on Islamic infiltration and the threat posed by them. We'll be discussing CARE/Hamas and their links in Tennessee. Hope you'll join us again next week. That's it for now. Good night from Paris, Tennessee, that is.